Constance Christine Smith was born on July 11th, 1942, in Sundance, Wyoming. She had lived there with her father, Peter Smith, older brother, Nels, born 1939, and her mother, Helen. Also known as Connie, she was the granddaughter of former Wyoming Governor Nell Smith, of which I believe he is his grandson's namesake. Connie is described to have been well-traveled, get along with adults, other kids, and loved animals, especially horses. Connie went missing in Salisbury, Connecticut on July 16, 1952, where she had been staying at Camp Sloom, a YMCA summer camp. It was stated that it was her first time at a summer camp, and many articles believed that she was homesick. On the morning of her disappearance, she had received a bloody nose after an altercation with several other female campers. That same morning, Connie told her tent mates that she was skipping breakfast to return an ice pack to the camp dispensary, which she had used the night before after falling out of her tent and hurting her hip, though some sources have stated that she hurt her lip. I believe that this is a typo, as most original sources say hip. It is forever unknown what that fight was about, as no sources have been able to confirm it, nor say who specifically was involved. I do not know why there were so many people in the fight, though some sources have said it was just Connie and one other girl. I do not know the truth. Apparently, in the early morning, Connie got a bloody nose when a tent mate climbing from the bunk above her accidentally kicked her in the face. Connie was going to the infirmary to return the ice pack, and she said, "See you at breakfast." On Wednesday morning, she told Miss Baker, her camp counselor, "I feel better this morning. I'll return the ice pack. I don't need it anymore." Instead of taking the ice pack back like she said, Connie left her tent and then left Camp Sloom, not taking any money or clothes with her. All her belongings were left behind. She stated to have walked down Indian Mountain Road where several people, or even up to 9, in some cases, had seen her on the roadside, allegedly picking daisies and asking people how to get to Lakeville, Connecticut. Some say that she was homesick and didn't want to stay for the final week of camp. Connie's disappearance was reported to Carol Baker, their group leader. She called the camp director, Ernest P. Roberts, who had the entire camp searched, and by 11:30 a.m. it was clear that Connie left the camp, of which he then said to call the police. 2 days before the disappearance, her mother visited her at the camp, where Connie is reported to have been in a good mood and had asked to stay at the camp longer, but wasn't upset when her mother declined. Connie's mother stated that her daughter was excited about being in a local horse show and wanted to stay at the camp until then. An article from 2009 stated that Connie was at camp for 3 weeks with a month to go. I'm not sure why there are varying degrees of this story. In my own personal opinion, I don't find it odd, though, for a child to want to go home after getting into a fight. The last time that Connie was seen was the day of her disappearance, which was by a married couple. They saw her attempting to hitchhike near the intersection of U.S. Route 44 and Belgo. Camp counselors reported her as missing 3 hours after leaving the camp. Connie had a stepsister named Dorothy Dyke of British Columbia, Canada. Connie's father was Dorothy's stepfather. Dorothy stated that she would have been 2 years older than Connie if she were still alive. Though she knew Connie, she had never lived with her. Dorothy also stated that it had not been easy for their family with Connie's disappearance. Peter Smith, their father, thought about Connie all the time and searched everywhere for her. He went back east about calls that came from people thinking they had found her, or from prisoners confessing to her murder. Dorothy doubted that Connie was still alive, where she is quoted as saying, "It's been such a long time. I think about her every time I hear on the news about the disappearance of a child." Apparently, back in Wyoming, Connie would camp alone at night. She rode horses and was used to farm life. Connie was known as a tomboy, while most girls were from New York City at the camp. Connie was said to have long arms and flat feet. She supposedly got along with the kids and the adults at the camp, and despite the story of her getting into a fight, Connie is said to have traveled widely and could converse intelligently on subjects unfamiliar to most 10-year-olds. In a flyer on her, it stated that she had an operation on both lateral muscles of the eyes for extrophia in September of 1950. She had a moderate degree of myopia, which was increasing every year and might have caused a sensitivity to light for her. Connie loved all animals, especially horses. She liked to swim and was considered a fair swimmer. She liked to color with crayons and read funny books. She made friends easily, could handle a baton, though apparently she wasn't very good at it. She had a vivid imagination, especially about her animal friends, like her pet, Rattlesnake, and a white mare named Tony that could swirl a baton. She also liked to play dress-up. Apparently, Connie's parents lived on adjoining ranches in Wyoming, but Helen was the one who had custody, according to one source. I think that any source that has stated that probably meant in the sense that Helen had custody of Connie for the summer, but not permanently. Helen brought Connie east to spend the summer with her grandparents, then was sent to Camp Sloom, which was operated by the Westchester, New York YMCA. On July 13th, 1952, Connie's mother and maternal grandparents stopped by to celebrate her birthday and deposit $5 into her account. Apparently, kids at the camp weren't allowed to have cash, but could make charges to their account. Connie was said to have been excited about a square dance at the camp that was to happen that next Friday, and a horse show scheduled for that Saturday. She wanted to stay longer at the camp than planned, but her mother said that was impossible because they were to leave for Wyoming at that same time. One of her counselors said that Connie looked homesick after her mother left. Her mother split time between Greenwich, Connecticut, and Sundance, Wyoming, and had visited 3 days before to deposit money in her account. A camp official saw Connie crying after her mother left. She appeared isolated, and there was a lack of telephones and reading material. She had broken her only pair of glasses, leaving her unable to escape unhappy moments by reading a favorite comic book. That might seem very repetitive, and in some ways it is, but there are so many sources that I was looking at over the period of these past 70 years that I felt like it was important in some ways to bring up these details. Many different sources have said many different things, and I wanted to at least list what majority of them corroborated with each other. But next came the search. Though police were able to pick up on her trail, it went cold on Route 44 near Belgo Road. The police decided it wasn't just a lost child case. Barracks over the state were alerted. Crack detectives rushed in, and jeeps were used in woody terrain. Bloodhounds were put on the trail. Overhead airplanes from the Connecticut wing of the Civil Air Patrol and Air Force planes from Westover Field, Massachusetts, were flown. Connie's mom drove from Greenwich. Her father came all the way from Wyoming. It was asked if either parent had kidnapped her from the other. Nonsense, they told the police. The police had to cover all possibilities, though, in case Connie's mother had taken her away from Peter. They wondered if there was any possibility that Helen Smith might have wanted to have her daughter for a while longer. Connie had been taught to walk downhill and follow a fence or road. They considered kidnapping a possible motive, but there were no ransom requests. No one in Lakeville itself had seen Connie, as she hadn't gotten on a bus or a taxi, nor had she visited any of the stores. Despite massive search efforts when she went missing, she was never found. An article in 2009 from the Hartford Courant stated that Connie's mother did an interview in the 50s. She stated that the unanswered questions made the loss more painful. It was stated that Connie's mother died of a broken heart from interviews with relatives in the 80s. According to an article by the Register Citizen, truck drivers, traveling carnival workers, gypsies from Arkansas who camped along Route 22 were questioned about Connie's disappearance. Every time a lead was found, her father went to investigate it. Almost immediately after Connie disappeared, police checked a nearby gypsy camp. Apparently, investigators hid in the forest for several days to see if Connie was being held against her will. Nothing came of it. Police drove around hoping to smell the scent of a decaying body, and animal scat was tested. And a police tip had came in that, if they were smart, someone would have buried her in someone else's grave. And so they checked in fresh graves. State troopers visited cemeteries, plunging rods through the dirt until they hit caskets. One article had stated that the troopers felt too creeped out to write a police report about what they were doing. A dozen troopers assigned to the Canaan barracks got help from volunteers and anyone who answered the fire alarm. The story drew national attention and theories. All known criminals in the area were questioned, but later cleared. A report from Cooperstown, New York stated that a child resembling Connie had passed through a town with a band of gypsies. Connie's father thought she might have been headed for the home of relatives in Chicago. He boarded a plane there and awaited for her arrival, but there were no results. Connecticut State Police searched hard. Police rode on mountain trails, circled reservoirs and lakes, drove through woods, searched on foot and along side roads. They donned hip boots and waded through swamps. Not even her clothes were found. The area is described as being littered with Revolutionary War-era ore pits, and the police searched there also, to no avail. More than 11,000 circulars were printed and tacked up in service stations, post offices, restaurants, schools, and fish and game departments around the country. Connie's dental records were printed in the Journal of the American Dental Association. Helen Smith posted the offer of 2 rewards for Connie's return. There was a rush to claim the $3,000 when a girl picked up in Texas said she was a runaway from an Indian reservation in New York. her picture was distributed to services, and telegrams from people who thought that they saw Connie poured into the Connecticut State Police headquarters. Texas Rangers exploded the hopes by announcing that the girl, who called herself Kim, was actually from Massachusetts and had a hankering for the Wild West, having hitchhiked to Texas. I'm not sure what happened to this girl after the conclusion of this part of her story. As Christmas of 1952 approached, her mother pled with hunters to look in old wells and deserted buildings. Whether she is alive or dead, I want her back. I've got to know what happened to her. Christmas was always such a big event in our house. But this year, I feel I can't stand it. Each day is a little harder to face. No one claimed the $3,000 reward posted by the family for Connie's safe return, or even the $1,000 for her body. Adjusted for inflation, that'd be $10,000 for the body and $32,000 for her safe return in 2022. Peter Smith met with a gypsy king and asked them if they still kidnapped children. The man apparently said, "Not anymore." An article from 2000 stated that Peter Smith had went to California to meet this person, who stated that they stopped the practice of kidnapping children and putting them to work before Connie disappeared. He stated that it was too expensive to maintain the children. Before anybody tries to come at me for using that term, I'm just only repeating what it has been stated in multiple newspaper articles. I don't agree with using certain words that are derogatory towards other groups. Anyway, Officer Chapman had recalled, though, that the search was the most extensive missing person search of their time. He traveled around the country chasing leads and hearing confessions. Convicted sex offender and death row inmate George Davies admitted at Wethersfield Prison to killing her. Chapman took Davies for a ride to find the body. It wasn't found, and Davies admitted to a false confession. One source stated that a human leg bone was found near a river in the area, and thanks to a wild goose chase from the inmate, of who I assume was George Davies, and in a later newspaper article it seems that it was George Davies they were talking about, this inmate was going to tell the police where they allegedly buried Connie. There doesn't seem to be any information of who the leg was from, though. One source stated, though, that the bone was from a victim who drowned in a hurricane. I don't know what hurricane or what year it was. Just before Davies' execution, he of course admitted to not killing Connie, but said that he enjoyed the sunshine and sandwiches he got outside of his cell. A delivery man who was interested in Connie's case would drive along country roads with his wife and stated that he didn't believe that George Davies could have murdered Connie because Davies was working at the time. He made assertions about the case and her clothes, and this apparently creeped out his wife, and at some point they divorced. I don't know what their names were. It seems that this was purposely hidden from the public. But in this story, the now ex-wife then reported her ex-husband to the police, and she told them that he had said that there was nothing left of Connie, where she was buried in the woods, and that Connie apparently tried to call her father the night before she vanished. The claim was never proven, and it had been unheard of by the police or Peter Smith at this time, of which neither received a call. The ex-husband's delivery route took him to Camp Sloom, according to her story. I don't know what he was delivering, though. When talking to the police, the ex-husband stated that everything he knew about the case came from the newspapers, and that while his route did take him around Camp Sloan, he had finished his job by 8 a.m. that day, which of course was before she went missing. He took a lie detector test and passed, and denied any involvement even decades after she went missing. I can only assume that the tidbits about her being buried in the woods and her clothes was probably just rumors from the local area. In state records, Connie's case is known as B-57H. The lead police investigator was Richard Chapman, who had been obsessed with the case even after retiring in 1973. Chapman lamented not having solved the case in a retirement speech. He died in 2011, though before his death, he is quoted as saying that he believed Connie was no more than 10 miles from the camp. After Chapman's retirement, the case was handed over to Litchfield's Western District Major Crime Squad. There are 650 pages of still confidential files on Connie's disappearance. Her case prompted a national search and the largest manhunt in Connecticut history. Detective Michaels inherited the files, though he is not allowed to show the contents of the folder, as the case is still open. Michael Downs was unable to confirm the details of the case, as one source had asked him. Downs stated, "No one actually knows what occurred. It's a desolate, rural area with plenty of land. There are area farms with 200 acres where anything could have happened, and a body could have been buried." Despite staff being interviewed, no one stood out as suspects. For the longest time, it was thought that she'd turn up with family or friends. On Web Sleuths, there is the story that in 1955, Connecticut State Trooper Leo Turcotte received a call from a man in Montreal who stated that he had worked for a carnival in the Lakeville area and knew about Connie's disappearance. There doesn't seem to be anything that came of that lead. Some sources stated that there were no carnivals going on in that area at the time. No one's been able to verify that a carnival took place when Connie disappeared. This tidbit, though, seems to be incorrect. What seems to have actually happened, according to a 2000 article, is that a man named William Duggan called collect shortly after 1 a.m. in 1955, saying that he wanted to get something off of his chest. He mentioned that he had worked in Hartford, Connecticut 15 years earlier, in 1940, at a circus. He agreed to meet Sergeant Richard Chapman the next day in Canada, but because of a recent flood that had happened in Connecticut, Connecticut State Police asked Canadian police to meet with the man and report their findings. The Canadian police never called back or reported anything. William Duggan's ex-wife was contacted by a state trooper and told them that William was a soldier stationed in Japan, not Canada. Police were left wondering the real identity of the 1955 caller. It was later in 1988 that Chapman, retired, had asked police on the case to investigate if William Henry Redmond would have been the caller, impersonating William Duggan. Now, I will admit at this point of the story, I didn't look up the William Duggan person. But I do have questions that if this William Duggan was stationed in Japan, does that mean that they were American and not Canadian? There didn't seem to be any more info in that newspaper article about that person. William Henry Redmond was charged in 1988 with strangling an 8-year-old girl from Pennsylvania who was named Jane Marie Altoff. His arrest came after a cross-reference of his fingerprints were found in the cab of a truck where Altoff was found. There was belief that Redmond was potentially in the Lakeville, Connecticut area. I'm not sure why or how exactly Sergeant Chapman was able to come across William Redmond's name, and where the connection exactly came from with him, wondering if he had something to do with Connie's disappearance. A number of women have come forward during the years, claiming to be Connie and had amnesia, but were later discounted with analysis or interrogation. One of the reasons why people believed that William Redmond might have had something to do with Connie's disappearance is that even though he was proven to have murdered Jane Marie Altoff, he later told another person in prison that he had killed 3 other people. But the judge determined that Redmond was too ill to stand trial, and he was sent back home to Nebraska, of which he died in 1989. Essentially not even getting any justice served for Jane Marie Altoff. According to a police report, in April 1953, a traveling jewelry salesman named Frederick Pope confessed to Ohio police that he knew where Connie was. Pope alleged that he and an associate named Jack Walker were traveling with a Rhode Island woman named Wilma Sames, and they picked up Connie on Route 44, promising her a ride back to Wyoming. Pope claimed that Walker killed Connie in Arizona, and that Pope later beat Walker to death with a tire iron. The story fell apart on examination, where there were no records of any Wilma Sames or Jack Walker to have existed. Pope later admitted that the story was fake and was dismissed as a suspect. According to an article from the Spokane Daily Chronicle, Frederick Walker Pope had also stated that he told the police in 1949 when he, aged 22, volunteered to St. Louis police a story that he knifed a man to death named Bill. He claimed to have buried him on a Los Angeles beach. LAPD couldn't find evidence of a crime and declined to ask for his detention. He was released in 4 days. Police Chief D.V. Long said police had not varied his story in the first 4 tellings. Peter Smith asked police to check into the story. An FBI agent heard the story on April 7th, 1953, where Pope claimed he was traveling with the man that allegedly killed Connie. While FBI questioned him, Peter Smith phoned Police Chief Long and asked him to do everything possible to see the thing through. I'm not sure when this happened in conjunction to later gaining advice from a psychic horse, as we'll hear about, and if that perhaps is why Peter Smith had went to LA because of that advice alone. In an article from 1962, Frederick Pope is quoted as saying, "I've been trying to do something for a long while to get into a hospital. This was my opportunity. I'm sorry I did it." As his reason for making up the fake story about Connie. Peter Smith even went on Art Linkletter's show asking for help and passed out posters to all the schools in the Los Angeles area. It had been said that Connie's case was among the first missing children's posters distributed around the country. In a 1984 interview, Peter Smith said that he imagined his daughter in the face of every woman he passed who would have been her age at that time. He always hoped that something would turn up. He recalled her softness for animals and flowers and liked to fill in coloring books and read comics. Connie's case file is reported to be 3 feet tall and to have taken detectives into 9 states. The disappearance was, of course, always on her family's mind, and Peter Smith even consulted psychics at one point. One source states that Peter went to a psychic horse named Lady Wonder, though I really don't have any other sources that state that. It's really just about like one newspaper article. But apparently, though, Lady Wonder told Peter Smith to go to Los Angeles. Lady Wonder was born on February 9th, 1924, and was thought to have psychic abilities. Lady was bottle-fed by her owner, Mrs. Fonda, and later played with alphabet blocks in order to train her to potentially communicate. Eventually, she outgrew the blocks, and Mrs. Fonda built a large typewriter for Lady, which she used by hitting her nose on padded keys, which then lifted tin cards containing letters and numbers. This allowed her to communicate with apparently more than 150,000 visitors, where she allegedly helped solve the case of a missing 4-year-old boy named Danny Matson in Quincy, Massachusetts. Lady spelled Pittsfield water wheel, and the police investigator concluded that there was not a water wheel in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Police Chief William Ferrazzi tried to interpret the message as field and wild water pit, a quarry that was close to Danny Matson's house that had already been searched. But a repeat search actually found the boy's body there. I tried to find some information about Danny Matson, and from a standard Google search, granted Google kind of sucks now to tell you the truth, I really couldn't find any sort of story about this boy that had went missing and then unfortunately turned out deceased. If I can, I will look it up more because I'm kind of curious how a 4-year-old ended up not around anymore. In December of 1952, 2 kids went missing in Naperville, Illinois. The mother of them went to Lady, who suggested the kids would be found at the DePage River, which was close to their house. 7 weeks later, the bodies of both kids were found frozen in the river. Skeptics, though, have pointed out that in both cases, these locations had been or were being searched already, and the horse's intervention essentially only served to preach to the choir. It became clear that Lady didn't really know anything, and her behavior was based off cues from Mrs. Fonda. There were several times when the horse was wrong, and when Mrs. Fonda didn't know an answer, Lady Wonder also answered incorrectly. In 1957, Lady passed away from a heart attack. An article from 1962 quotes Helen Smith as saying, "We were ready to try anything. We tried everything else we could think of." Unfortunately, it was just another scam and one more dead end. A 2002 article brought a new lead that police were to investigate. Carol Andrews went to the press and stated that she had lived in the New England area at the time and was also 10 years old when Connie disappeared. She claimed that her and her sister were playing together when two intimidating men came up to them and tried to talk to them. The girls hid as they found the men sinister and frightening, of which they later drove away. Carol claimed that she created a chant with her sister to remember the license plates of the men's car, which was QF 5876 on a New York plate. Carol later learned that the men were two fugitives, armed and dangerous, though she didn't know what they were wanted for. The police claimed that they were going to research the history of the license plate and try to see if the owner of that car were still alive or if the car was ever stolen. Nothing ever seems to have been updated on this tidbit, and especially now, that is 20 years ago. Going back to when Connie disappeared, we will take a look at the people who allegedly saw her last. One of the main parts of the story is that Connie had supposedly walked away from the camp, and apparently multiple people saw her and sort of talked to her before she vanished completely. The camp's caretaker, though, August Epp, told police that he saw Connie leave the camp, picking daisies as she walked. He didn't stop her because he thought that she was old enough to be a camp counselor, which to me tells me that he didn't really know her well enough to recognize her. It honestly makes me wonder if it was really her and if the story is even real. Now, I'm not trying to cloud your view, but that's just kind of some of the details that I thought of first when reading this part of the story. Now, as it goes, Connie allegedly turned right on Indian Mountain Road past Deep Lake Farm. A pair of farmhands who had been out late the night before were among the many suspected. August Epp is, of course, the name of the gatekeeper who worked at Camp Sloom during that time period of when she went missing. His house was stated to have been down the road that Connie walked on, it having been a dirt road at the time. Epp was apparently the first of 9 people that regretted not having done something to help Connie. At approximately 8:15 a.m., Epp was working in his yard when he saw this girl come out the gate and head north towards Lakeville. I think she stopped to pick some flowers, then continued. I didn't think it was one of the camp girls. She was so tall. I thought it was a counselor. That's why I didn't pay much attention to her. A quarter of a mile north, a Mr. and Mrs. E. Hobbs of Hortsman were out for an early walk and passed by Connie. We didn't speak, one of them said. About a half-mile from the camp, Mrs. William Walsh, a housewife, answered a knock on her door. There was a girl who asked, "Could you tell me the way to Lakeville?" Miss Walsh replied, "Continue on up the hill and then turn right on Route 44. The girl asked, "Do you mean straight up the hill?" Mrs. Walsh affirmed and stated, "That's right, straight up the hill." And even though the child looked like she'd been crying, Miss Walsh didn't feel like that was her business. Apparently, girls were always stopping by from the camp, asking the way to Lakeville. A couple of minutes later, Mrs. Walsh saw the girl, presumably Connie, walking up the hill. Now, allegedly, traffic on Route 44 was heavy that day. Near Belgo Road, Connie tried to hitch a ride from a Mr. and Mrs. John Brune, headed to their Lakeville business establishment. They drove past her and saw her walking towards Lakeville. At 8:45 a.m., Mrs. Frank E. Barnett, a housewife, was driving from Millerton on Route 44 just before turning into Belgo Road. She saw Connie walking east on the northern side of Route 44. At this time, the several other girls that shared their tent with Connie found that she hadn't shown up for breakfast. They called her parents, and her father came from Wyoming and rented a car and a horse, and he chartered his own plane and stayed several weeks in the area. An article from Crime Door stated that the fight Connie got into was because the other kids thought that she was too posh. This is honestly something I had suspected, that potentially she was beat up for being a rich kid, especially since her grandfather had been a governor at one point. Obviously, her Wyoming family had money, considering the resources her father used, and even his own obituary that stated he was a powerful man. Crime Door states that Connie was upset at her mother's decision not to let her stay at the camp longer. The fact, though, that there are differing details to this story is pretty suspicious to me, and it leads me to believe that, honestly, Connie was murdered. Potentially, even at the camp itself, and I feel like there might be some sort of cover-up. The camp official possibly said that he did see her to cover for himself, and since it would have looked worse if he admitted to not seeing her at all. I wonder if the camp counselors were part of the bullying too, to be completely honest with you. Or if they were the real ones that were actually messing with Connie. I figure that either somebody didn't like her because they knew she came from money, or potentially she was bullied for other reasons and it might have gone too far. The perpetrators may not have initially known what relations Connie had until she ended up in the media. And that's why I feel like her disappearance is some sort of cover-up, because if Connie had her remains, I think, in nature somewhere, I really do believe that 70 years later she would have turned up, especially since that is still a very popular and, I guess you could say, lived-in place. Camp Sloom is still used to this day. I also do wonder, to be completely truthful with you, if these people that claimed to have witnessed her saw her walking down the road, I wonder if they really saw her. The fact that she got into a fight before she disappeared, and yet nobody seemed to have mentioned anything about her having a bloody nose. It either tells me that, well, maybe Connie didn't get kicked in the nose and she didn't have a bloody nose, or maybe that person they are talking about might not have been Connie at all. That might be pretty controversial to say, but it's actually been proven in recent years that witness testimony is not actually as good as we might have thought. Now, on Crime Door, they stated that Connie's tent mates returned from breakfast to find the ice pack still there and Connie gone. And, of course, all of her things were still there. Supposedly, her friends searched the campgrounds, but when they couldn't find her, they alerted camp counselors. Indian Mountain Road that Connie had allegedly walked on is reportedly a heavily wooded area with large fields and trees, and the houses spaced out. I'm unsure, though, of what it was like in 1952 exactly. Crime Door also stated that the husband and wife who saw Connie last found her crying on their steps. When she asked for Lakeville, they pointed her in the right way. They apparently didn't know she was 10, as she was well-spoken and well-developed. If this even happened, I don't understand why these people wouldn't have just taken her to Lakeville, whether she was a child or not. Honestly, it's not surprising if Connie potentially did still go the wrong way somehow, because she didn't have her glasses and apparently she could barely see. The camp was In some instances, it says 5 miles to Lakeville, though some accounts say a quarter mile. So it seems odd to me that she didn't make it there to Lakeville, because either way, it was really close. On top of that, I don't understand why the couple that saw her last didn't let her use the phone. Granted, they might not have had one, but to not offer a ride that is at most 5 miles to town or let her use the phone seems weird to me. Of course, I have my doubts, obviously, whether this account is even true, as it seems that there are multiple people who claimed to be the last ones to have seen her. And one thing I've always been questioning in my head is, how can you know that you are the last one to see her? Truthfully, if you were the last one to see her, then, well, that makes you suspicious, right? Now, of course, the names of the neighbors were recorded and they were questioned. Some sources state that it was mostly women and they were mostly homemakers. This is pretty much true, as I had seen in the newspaper clippings that I had looked into. The story, though, apparently of Connie picking flowers might have just taken a life on its own, because at some point her mother had told a reporter initially that Connie enjoyed picking flowers and liked to make daisy flower necklaces. And I think that this is true also because the articles I was looking at, you really didn't see the daisy or picking daisies until like 10 years after she went missing. So it's like articles from 1962 and beyond were kind of the ones to start doing that. There were apparently known pedophiles, though, working in the camp area, though I am unsure if there were any at this camp specifically. The camp was very concerned with their reputation and the well-to-do parents who sent their kids to the camp. The camp is only a little more than 100 miles to New York City, and apparently many of the children that go to Camp Sloom are from there. It is possible, if she was kidnapped, that she could have been taken to NYC. And honestly, if that's the case, truthfully, she could have been anywhere after that. And I think that's something her father, Peter Smith, realized. An article from 2000 stated that there was suspicion cast on the groundskeeper, of which I assume was August Epp. And then there was suspicion on the camp cook, delivery workers, nearby workers, neighboring private school students, local sex offenders, fishermen, and more. There doesn't seem to be any proven sex offenders that worked at Camp Sloom, at least nothing that ended up in the news, as far as I know. On August 4th, 1954, there was an article posted about a picture of a group of bathers at a Bronx beach, published in the Hartford Courant on July 13th, 1954. One of the girls was noted to look like Connie. The posting of the picture spurred interest in the case again, but a state police official doubted if that person was really her. The Missing Persons Bureau visited New York Police Headquarters, and I guess they made them keep the case in their active file. It was stated that if Connie wasn't found by the time school reopened that year, prints of the photograph would be distributed to schools in the Bronx. The pictures themselves, I believe, were made at Orchard Beach. It was noted, though, that Peter Smith thought that the girl bore a marked resemblance to Connie. The next day, though, a Mrs. May Sedgwick identified the girl in the photo as her daughter, Virginia. Some of the sightings after this just kind of got really crazy to me. There was a housewife in upstate New York who claimed to have seen Connie riding a horse in front of her house. An upstate New York construction worker claimed that he shared his lunch with a runaway girl. A woman from Great Barrington, Massachusetts, thought that she saw Connie at the annual fall fair. A service station operator in Mabbittsville, New York, stated that they saw her with another band of gypsies. There was a group of itinerant orchard workers who spent the summer in New England and were trailed all the way to Los Angeles. A woman stated that she saw a girl with long brown hair and a red garment and a large milk truck the day Connie went missing. Another woman stated that she saw a girl that fit Connie's general description at about 3 p.m. that day she went missing on Lime Rock Road. She apparently called to the girl, but the child walked back into the woods. A man from Colebrook stated that he saw her 3 days after she disappeared. A picture was sent to the police with a picture of a crowd in Alabama. Sergeant Chapman stated, "We were sent a picture of a crowd at a football game in Alabama, and there was a circle around a face in the crowd. She was the spitting image of Connie Smith." Unfortunately, police were unable to trace who the person was. Ultimately, these sightings turned up nothing. Other theories as to what potentially happened to Connie include: 1, that she may have been the victim of a hit and run, with the driver potentially stuffing her body in the car and driving away, though there were no traces of blood or an accident on Route 44. Sergeant Richard Chapman had stated in a 1974 article that he believed she could have been picked up by a motorist and slain, with her body potentially buried in one of the many Revolutionary War era mines. These mines were stated to be deep and filled with water, and one in particular was near Route 44. It was stated to have been about 3 to 4 acres. And though Chapman wanted to pump the mine, it was virtually impossible because the water was fed through underground streams. If Connie's body was thrown into a lake or a water-filled mine, it should have risen eventually, unless it was in deep, cold water. Chapman deeply believed at that time that she was picked up in a car and taken away. The second theory is that Connie could have wandered down to the Waconskop Lake, which is one of the deepest waters in that part of the country, being 90 feet in some spots. Though none of the people that were in and on the lake that day had seen her, and it apparently was stated by her parents that Connie was such a good swimmer that drowning was impossible. And the third theory is that Connie might have gotten that ride. It is highly believed that she was homesick, and in articles about her from the 50s and 70s, they repeated this contention a lot for being homesick. And I know that's pretty much the same thing as the first theory, but it's just kind of thought as she might have been picked up by somebody and then killed and dumped in that same spot, or that she was picked up and kidnapped and who knows what happened next. Now, there have been, of course, various comparisons and exclusions to Connie's case. And one of the most popular Jane Does that have been quote-unquote ruled out is an unidentified girl colloquially known as Little Miss X. Connie was previously ruled out as having been Little Miss X, of which a girl whose remains were discovered on Halloween of 1958. Little Miss X, also abbreviated to LMX in online forums, is described as having been 11 to 17 years old, white or Hispanic, or of potential Mexican and Native American descent, was 5 foot to 5'3" tall, 105 pounds, and presumed to have died of homicide, though the exact cause of her death is unknown. Her body was but skeletal remains when discovered, and the post-mortem interval is believed to have been anywhere from 9 to 18 months. Now, Little Miss X had reddish-brown hair that was dyed a lighter brown color and thought to be wavy. It may not have been natural, but I personally wonder if the hair's color may have been bleached by the sun. Her teeth were in good condition with 7 fillings, and though the body was nude, the clothes were found near her, but they appeared to have been too big for her. The items found around LMX include a short-sleeved white cardigan, a white cotton maiden-form alouette bra that was a 34C, white rayon underwear, size small, with an elastic top and bottom, brown, red, and green patterned capri pants from World Gammon's Graph California Wear, an 18-inch 10-karat gold chain with tiny curb-style links, a small jar of Pond's cold cream, Pond's being a skin brand, a powder puff with traces of suntan colored powder, a small blue plastic nail file with the letter P indented in script and the letter R in handprint. This has led some to believe that LMX is another girl named Donis Marie Pinky Redmond, who is a girl that went missing with her boyfriend on March 1st, 1958, which is also 7 months prior to LMX's discovery. And finally, there was a white nylon comb. Despite the belief that LMX was Pinky Redmond, there are sources that state she was ruled out from the case, though this is based on dentals. Another girl thought to be LMX was Mary Begay, who was also excluded, though I'm unsure in which way exactly. The reason why I say this, though, is because Little Miss X's profile on NamUs, which shows all genetic exclusions to missing and unidentified persons, is empty. There is not a single exclusion to her genetically. The reason for this, I believe, is that LMX's remains have been lost. After they were taken across the country to compare to Connie Smith's dental records, the remains were buried in an unmarked grave in Arizona. Any DNA that was left over before the burial was apparently not sufficient enough to do any comparisons. Authorities believed that they had found the spot that she was buried in 2018, but it was not her. In 2020, they were preparing to search in another spot, though I have yet to hear anything of the outcome. Checking Connie Smith's NamUs page, you will not, of course, see an exclusion for Little Miss X either. In general, there have been 10 comparisons to her case, and the oldest one from 1968. She has not been compared to Jane Does of the 50s. That said, it may be possible that Connie is Little Miss X, though I do have strong doubts. Now, the facial reconstruction from Nemec, I think looks a lot like Connie, but I can't help but be a little skeptical because I do wonder if the person that made that reconstruction did so because they were thinking of Connie Smith. And it's kind of hard to to say exactly that Little Miss X is Connie without, of course, genetic confirmation or denial, and the fact that Little Miss X was believed to have been Hispanic or Native American, which Connie was not, and she respectively was Swedish and Danish. Connie herself, though, is described as having been a white female, 5 feet tall, 85 pounds, with dark blonde shoulder-length hair, of which she wore a red ribbon in. She had blue eyes, a slight scar under her right nostril, flat feet, and, I quote, unusually long arms. Doe Network lists that dental records and DNA is available. Connie was also very nearsighted and wore glasses at the time she disappeared, but she did not have them on her. Some sources state that Connie may have had her glasses with her, and other sources claim that she didn't take them at all. When she disappeared, her glasses were broken, and she was unable to read without them. Some sources also claim that she was tall and well-developed, which, honestly, I think is pretty creepy. She's also said to have been very suntanned, and her teeth were just erupting. A 1962 article states that she could have passed for 12 or 13. On Namus, there are 3 bodies found before the 70s in Connecticut, though they are from 1944. There do not seem to be any unidentified bodies in Connecticut from the 50s. After Little Miss X was found, a letter with a tip was received by the Connecticut State Police, and a comparison of Little Miss X and Connie was done in 1962. Unfortunately, the results were inconclusive. In 2004, the state police gathered DNA from Nell Smith, which is Connie's brother, but by then, of course, the remains of LMX were buried and could not be found. Little Miss X's body was determined to not have been that of any local girls, on top of Connie's, and she was buried in Citizen Cemetery, which has long been a resting place for unidentified bodies, as quoted from one source. Little Miss X's records of burial have been lost for decades. I do wonder, honestly, if Connie had been kidnapped but also ended up being Little Miss X, why would someone take her, give her a filling at the dentist's, and then for some reason kill her, let alone dump her body at the Grand Canyon? LMX was found presumably 18 months after her death, so of course the timeline doesn't fit in with Connie, who had disappeared 6 years before. When it comes to LMX, there are still many unknowns about her case, such as, did she die at the Grand Canyon, or was she dumped there? How is it possible for a dead body to go undiscovered for over a year in a rather popular area? Are there any signs of animals having eaten the body and bones? If LMX is Connie, how did she end up in Arizona all the way from Connecticut? And what did she do for those 6 years in between? I have to wonder about what the dentist said, that the fillings in LMX's skull looked like his work. I kind of just don't understand this in general, because I'm thinking, are dentists just doing their own thing and not really following a standard procedure? I thought that there was a standard protocol that they had to follow. And honestly, I mean, is there a way to prove that a filling was done by a certain dentist specifically? Little Miss X was found about 6 miles off the road on Skinner Ridge, 10 miles south of the Grand Canyon. Samuel E. Hanchetta and his son Timothy, 15, were hunting on Halloween 1958 when they found the skeleton. Parts of the hands, feet, arm, and leg bones were missing. A likeness was made from the skull and created a clay facial sculpture. I don't know what happened to the clay sculpture, but I've never seen a picture of it. LMX, once again, is believed to have been Mexican Native American or Mexican Caucasian, with the same height and weight descriptions as before, but one source states that she might have been 110 pounds, and she may have had dark brown hair, bleached to light brown. She carried 7 silver amalgam fillings in 4 teeth. Undersheriff Deputy Cole of the LMX area drove to the Smith Ranch in Wyoming to meet with Connie's dentist, who was unable to identify the remains as definitely being Connie through the jaw and teeth alone. From the ranch, Deputy Cole drove to Denver for further forensic doctors to not be able to say positively that the remains were Connie. The remains were then returned to Arizona, and the sheriff at the time was apparently defeated in the next election that came up. And so I guess this is what happened with the random shuffling of LMX's remains. And so the previous sheriff was beaten in the election, and he and the deputy were later replaced. And during this time period, what happened to her remains is unknown. I do honestly worry that LMX wasn't actually buried in the cemetery, and maybe somebody took them and they might have had them in their house forever. I don't know. Best case scenario, she is buried in that cemetery in an unmarked grave, and it's just a matter of time before they can hopefully find her. On May 2nd, 2012, a user named Taillights posted that evidence found in an old case file of LMX's was sent to a lab to test DNA, though ultimately no DNA could be extracted. I think that without DNA evidence, we will never know if Little Miss X is Connie or any other girl. A Jane Doe was thought of a potential match, though she was later dismissed. The doe was found on July 31st, 1988 in Irondequoit, New York, but was estimated to have died 10 to 30 years prior, which would have been anywhere from 1958 to 78. This is not compared to Connie's case on Namus, so I wonder if there was ever a true DNA match done. This doe was estimated to have been 14 to 23 years old, white, and estimated to have been 5'2". All parts were discovered, though, as a complete skeleton. She was found by a young boy who was digging at the rear of his property. 4 white buttons were found during the recovery of the remains. None of the comparisons proven to not be Connie come from New York. Irondequoit doe's cause of death was undetermined, though it is considered suspicious. On the Doe Network, she is said to have been anywhere from 4'10" to 5'5", though her weight, hair color, and eye color are unknown. There were no signs of prior trauma or injury. Dentals are available, though it states she had significant dental restorations using gold foil at teeth 7 through 10, and her front teeth overlapped. Jane had been buried head first, though not much else is known about her, and any testing about where she came from has not been posted publicly. From the dentals alone, this may mean she isn't Connie, but to me, Little Miss X is as much of a possibility too. There aren't any missing or unidentified persons from that time period in Massachusetts. I chose to look up any possibilities on NamUs since the location of Connie's disappearance borders that of the state of New York. Though there are some Jane Does in the area from 1982 to the 1994 era, they do not have actual ages listed on NamUs. One entry, though, appeared to have been an infant. The same lack of age-appropriate does is true for New York. The earliest listed doe for New York is in the 70s. The results were the same for the Doe Network. Despite there having been a Jane Doe aged anywhere from 12 to 18 years, she was proven not to be a match, and her case has been shown as excluded on NamUs. There is a Jane Doe from Montauk, New Jersey, found on June 24th, 1980, that is estimated to have been 15 to 20 years old. She has no comparisons on NamUs. On the Doe Network, it states that she died years prior, but gives no number or span of time. The same is also true on NamUs, so there's little to go on with the date range. Based off the clothes, I would guess that she passed away in the late 60s or early 70s, and they don't seem to have been the right size as Connie, but once again, you can never be sure. On November 25th, 2021, there was an article from the Connecticut Insider posted that a skull was found in the area of Old Turnpike Road North. It was confirmed to be human. It's still too early to know what may have happened for the skull to be there, let alone its potential age and gender. The article did not say anything about a predicted date of death or how long it had been there. Connie had an older brother, Nels Smith, who the Register Citizen described him as having been tall and rugged. Throughout the decades, the family was still very traumatized from the event. Nels never had any opportunity to really talk with his father about it, and after Peter Smith's death, Nels still had a lot of questions. He was 13 years old when his sister went missing, and at the time of the Register Citizen article, he was 79 years old and living in Sand Creek, South Dakota. In 2022, I believe he's still alive and would be about 83 years old. Nels was a retired rancher and real estate businessman. When LMX's remains were found, he called his mother's attention to an article talking about the Jane Doe. Helen Smith rejected the idea, saying that Arizona was too far from Connecticut, though Nels found that that wasn't really relevant. The remains were described as possibly American Indian, and Nell stated that Connie had rather high cheekbones, which could certainly account for the latter point. And to be truthful, I don't know if it was genetically confirmed if that was what LMX really was. I know that there are testings that scientists can do to at least narrow down ethnicity, but considering her body, her remains were lost after about 1962. I'm not sure if this was just speculation or not. According to the Associated Press, the Denver sheriff announced that the remains were not that of Connie Smith. This was allegedly backed by Colorado dental surgeon Dr. David Berman and a pathologist, Dr. George I. Ogura. I believe that this was the initial ruling from 1962. In 1961, at the age of 47, Connie's mother passed away of a heart attack. Nels is quoted as saying, "Mother had died before someone in the Connecticut State Police caught the similarities in Connie's dental chart and that of Little Miss X. Of the 5 points of identification on the LMX dental chart, one was a filling that could have been done after Connie disappeared on July 16th, 1952. The remaining 4 points of dental identification, and not necessarily the fillings, were identical to Connie's dental chart. 3 fillings were of the same technique and material used by Dr. Floyd Ward, who was the Smith family dentist at the time, who examined the Little Miss X skull and jaw. He said 3 of the 4 fillings were identical to his work. He speculated that they could be his work and materials. And thus, this starts a sort of battle as to whether the dentals alone can confirm or deny whether Little Miss X is really Connie Smith. And so for some people, they really truly believe that the dentals alone can confirm, or they can alone deny that it's Connie. Some people, like her brother, really believed from the dentals alone that it was Connie. He's quoted as saying that the last point was of a small indentation in the palate directly beneath, behind, and between the 2 incisors. Dr. Ward said it was impossible for him to determine if this indentation was naturally occurring or the result of the surgical removal of a supernumerary tooth, which was the case with Connie. A supernumerary tooth is an extra tooth that appears in addition to the regular number of teeth. They're typically removed if they overcrowd the mouth. And as it appeared, and this was something that the article from the Register Citizen, which in my personal opinion was not a very well written article, it stated that Connie had an extra tooth that was removed. And so this article in particular was kind of in this battle between whether this gap that seemed to have been in Little Miss X's jaw or skull was just a natural gap that occurred in her head, or if this gap was from an extra tooth being removed. And so the idea was that if it was an extra tooth that was removed, then that basically means that Little Miss X was Connie. But after multiple people had looked at it, it was just an inconclusive thing to confirm or deny. Nels continued in another quote as saying, "At this point, the skull was examined by a pathologist in Denver in an attempt to determine whether the indentation was natural or the result of surgery. I was told that the pathologist's opinion was that the indentation was natural. I have since learned, and I believe reliably, that it is virtually impossible to tell the difference after any surgery has completely healed, and that the pathologist's report so indicate. That perspective on the case has stayed on my mind. It is very strong. In my mind, I want to bring closure. It is a strong possibility that Little Miss X is Connie." According to Nels, with the exception of the 4th filling, LMX's skull matched the dental records for Connie. The additional filling could have been somehow gotten between the period of Connie's disappearance and the discovery of Little Miss X. He's quoted as having said, "It could have been the remains, but nothing was done. I didn't push it at the time. Mother died in 1961. supposedly Connie's mother died of a broken heart. The family dentist, as stated before, had said that 3 of the 4 fillings found in LMX were his work. The gap in the teeth was still there, and Mother, Nels had stated, had joked that the gap was so wide you could throw something through it. The story at the time was that it was a naturally occurring indentation, and it was decided it wasn't Connie. Peter Smith didn't want Connie to be gone. Nels felt like his father didn't want to accept tangible proof that Connie may have been deceased. He believes and is convinced that LMX is Connie, and he stated that, "My take is that he was denying the evidence and just holding out hope for Connie in regards for his father." Now, to summarize the rest of the Register Citizen article, they had asked other doctors with dental backgrounds just more of their beliefs on if you could pretty much prove or deny this possibility just from looking at it at dental records alone. And honestly, it just felt like everybody they asked didn't really help. Pretty much, yes, you can look at dental records and compare that way, but of course at the same time too, without DNA evidence, you can't truthfully confirm or deny. And there are situations where certain things like superimposition of cranial x-rays are used to confirm, oh, this is so-and-so, or deny it's so-and-so. The same is done, of course, with dental records too. Oh yes, these are absolutely Chris, or they're not Chris. Now, all these people that the Register Citizen did not actually handle Little Miss X's remains because, of course, they are lost to history. But the fact that there are different doctors, even to this day, stating that you could or could not identify someone just puts more question into the air as to whether Little Miss X is Connie or not. What I just don't understand is how, once again, how could Little Miss X be Connie Smith if Little Miss X was believed to be a whole other ethnicity and was proven to have an extra filling in another tooth that Connie didn't have? Once again, without DNA evidence, the possibility of LMX being Connie is always out there. But of course, there's the possibility that she may not be her too. In modern day, there doesn't seem to be a Find a Grave page for Connie. There is one for both of her parents, which the first I found was her father, of which the entire time that I investigated this case, I actually couldn't find one single picture of actually any of her family members, except for, of course, her grandfather, because he had once been a governor. So it's pretty interesting to me that we kind of don't know what any of these people looked like. I feel like it would have potentially been helpful to see, like, oh, that's what Peter Smith looked like, or Helen Smith looks like, so that if maybe Connie wasn't killed right away, we might have had an idea of what she might have looked like as an adult. Peter Franklin Smith was born on November 28th, 1914, in Sundance, Wyoming. He passed away on February 22nd, 2012, at the age of 97 in Quino Nuevo, Mexico. He's buried at the Green Mountain Cemetery in Horton, Wyoming. He graduated high school at the age of 16 and later enrolled at the University of Nebraska, though I'm not sure if he finished his education based off his obituary alone. Peter married Helen Jensen at her parents' home in Greenwich, Connecticut on October 23, 1937. Nels Jensen was born in 1939 and Constance, 1942. The couple divorced in 1949 for reasons unknown, and Peter later married Otis Horton in 1950, where she brought along her daughters, Ellen and Dorothy. He died with his son Nels by his side. Though just a few months shy, he died on what was the 60th year of Connie's disappearance. Connie's mother, Helen Jensen, was born on January 14th, 1915, in Connecticut. She died on December 30th, 1961, at Weston County, Wyoming. She's buried in Putnam Cemetery in Greenwich, Connecticut. Her obituary says that she attended Syracuse University and lived in Wyoming when married to Peter, but moved back in with her parents after the divorce. Interestingly, it says, because her husband was a powerful man, her daughter lived with him in Wyoming. Connie had been at the camp for 2 weeks when she went missing. Helen and her parents made the drive from Greenwich to celebrate her birthday. Foul play was suspected. It seems that Helen never remarried, and she seems to have been alone for those last 10 years of her life. I honestly wonder how she met Peter Smith in the first place, as, of course, Connecticut and Wyoming are very far apart. A quick obituary for Connie's mom was posted in the Casper Star-Tribune in Casper, Wyoming on December 31st, 1961. It doesn't say anything new other than her daughter feared as the victim of an unknown killer. It does not mention any spouse, and she passed away in Sundance. Another article was posted on December 31st by the Rapid City Journal, but with no additional info. Despite the Find a Grave page saying that she had been in Connecticut when she died, it seems that actually she did spend the rest of her life in Wyoming, and after the divorce, Helen actually just lived on an adjoining ranch right next to Peter Smith. So, and I did look, and I really tried to find and search anything, but I don't know what was the cause of the divorce. I'm not sure if it was cheating and the conditions of Peter Smith gaining custody, but Helen still living right next to them. It's just kind of strange to me all around. Peter Smith's second wife, Otis G. Butler, was born on March 23, 1902, in Norway, making her 12 years older than him. Her first husband died in 1947. She passed away on October 1st, 1996, at the age of 94. She's buried at Green Mountain Cemetery in Horton, Wyoming. On her page, it states that she and Peter Smith married in 1962 and not 1950, as stated on his profile. Either way, it's unknown, but they are resting together. Granted, the 1950 date would make more sense, because if Connie's stepsister, Dorothy, had known Connie before she disappeared, then, well, I guess they would have gotten married in 1950. Connie's grandfather, Nels Hansen Smith, is buried at the same cemetery as her father. He was born on August 27th, 1884, in Gayville, South Dakota. He served as the governor of Wyoming from 1939 to 1943. He died on July 5th, 1976, at the age of 91. I took a quick search on Find a Grave to see if there were any online unmarked or unknown graves around the Lakeville, Connecticut area. I couldn't find any that were remotely close to Connie's time period. Most of the cemeteries had the online profiles named, and granted, this part of America is pretty old, so it's not uncommon to see graves from the 1700s with legacies of family buried there, and so those headstones are known. Other incidents at Camp Sloom. George Winterrich. In an article from July 25th, 1940, the camp pled not guilty for having a camp doctor working without a medical license in the state of Connecticut. The camp director was Ernest P. Roberts, who would be the same director 12 years later when Connie would go missing. On July 17th, 1940, there was an outbreak of food poisoning that ended up being investigated by the state health department. Case records signed by Dr. Fry indicated he was practicing, despite the camp director saying that the New York doctor had been engaged merely to render first aid and maintain a general check on the health of campers. 2 state policemen went with the state health official to the camp. An 11-year-old boy named George Hubach Winterrich, son of New York newspaperman John T. Winterrich, died in a hospital on July 15th, 1940, at a hospital in Sharon, Connecticut, after he'd been stricken ill at the camp. Dr. J.S. Chaffee, the Sharon, Connecticut medical examiner, attributed the 11-year-old's death to a streptococcus infection, of which I do have to point out, as actually one source had stated that it wasn't exactly something he died of quickly. Of course, the streptococcus infection that George Winterrich had of course manifested and got worse over a period of time. So by the time George had died, he had already had the strep infection for a while. I don't know how he got this infection, and from what I imagine, it must have been some sort of skin infection as opposed to the normal, like, oral or throat version. And since they were at a camp outside and in the outdoors, I do wonder if it was some sort of strep infection that might have eaten his skin or something, and potentially he went into shock. The state health department determined it was not connected with the food poisoning, the strep infection that is. The food poisoning, which was technically a separate event on its own, but happening at the same time, launched the Connecticut authorities to launch an inquiry on July 17th, 1940, after 57 people eating a Saturday night meal at the camp became sick with food poisoning. There were 300 boys and girls at the camp that summer, and there was no exact cause of the food poisoning, which sent 2 of the campers to the infirmary. Milk, water, and food was tested, and yet there were no results. Ernest P. Roberts and Dr. Fry actually pled nolo contendere in Superior Court, and each were fined $100. The execution of the fines were suspended indefinitely, which, in other words, they didn't even have to pay for that crime. Adjusted for inflation, the fine is still laughably small, which would have only been about $2,000 in 2022. Eventually, Ernest P. Roberts and Dr. Fry were sued by George's parents, though I do not know the end result of that case, despite trying to look it up. I could find no more information on the doctor at that camp, and he seems to have just vanished. George Winterrich is buried at Island Pond Cemetery in Ludlow, Massachusetts. There is a Find a Grave page for him, though at the time it was not connected to his parents' profiles. At the time of recording, I do see that they are connected, thankfully. John Tracy Winterrich was born on May 25th, 1891 in Middletown, Connecticut. He made a career in the military, but also as an editor. He passed away on August 15th, 1970, at the age of 79. He's buried at Island Pond also with his wife. On August 2nd, 1954, there was an article about a 10-year-old boy who went missing from Camp Sloom. Frederick Skippy Squires was reported safe at home in Englewood, New Jersey, after a 5-hour search. The camp director at this time was Robert Burr, who took over after Ernest P. Roberts. Burr called the police when the boy left camp at 10 a.m., to go frog hunting. Though, in another possibly horrifying fact, the boy had hitchhiked a ride home. Thankfully, though, he did make it home safe and called, saying that he was okay. In 1958, there was an article in the news about a blizzard that left 16 Boy Scouts snowbound at the camp. An Olympic ski star named Old Hag was a caretaker for the camp on Long Pond. The skier went to the camp to check on the boys, and they stated that they were fine. Old Hag learned that they were snowbound when one of the campers skied to his house to tell their parents, of which I assume by phone, that they were safe. Old Hag carried food and provisions to the scouts, who were all from Westchester County, New York. The scouts arrived the day before in 4 cars and had expected to leave the next day, but the snow changed their plans. They planned to leave that Monday afterwards. I did try to look up Old Hag, and I couldn't find anything about this Olympic skier. There was once a girl named Sarah Storms who attended Camp Sloan in the late 70s and returned to the camp as a counselor in 1979. Her family was told that she had received a phone call, then borrowed a camp van. She was found dead next to the van, which had crashed near the camp. She was a friend of one of the Web Sleuth posters, Truly. There was an anecdotal story from the user on Web Sleuth that talked about their friend, Sarah Storms. The user was a friend of hers, and they felt like the camp didn't bring up Sarah ever. I looked up a Sarah Storms on Find a Grave, and the one profile I believe is her is a girl who passed away on August 11th, 1979. She was born on December 10th, 1960, and was just a few months away from her 19th birthday. There aren't any profiles linked to her page at all, and there isn't a description. It is unknown how she died based off the page alone. She's buried at Willow Cemetery in Ridgewood, New Jersey. Sarah Storms' death is also backed up by an SSDI record. A Connecticut death index stated that she was white, never married, and born in Hackensack, New Jersey. She passed away on August 11th, 1979, in Salisbury, Connecticut. She had lived in Ridgewood, New Jersey, and her parents were Anne and E. Bruce Storms. Sarah had 2 siblings who, for the sake of privacy and assumption they are still alive, I will not name them. An obituary from the Record stated that a memorial was held at Ridgewood United Methodist. It stated that she had injuries sustained from an auto accident. She had moved to Ridgewood at the age of 4 and had graduated high school in 1979, just months before her death. She was the captain of the high school's color guard, and Sarah planned on attending the University of Denver in September 1979. Sarah was a camp counselor at Camp Sloom and had also worked for Nursing Service, Inc. Memorial donations to Camp Sloom were appreciated. Another obituary from August 16th, 1979 was posted to the Ridgewood News, though it didn't really add anything new, and states that she was an automobile accident victim. Despite Sarah's death being established, it is unknown why she died. How did she get in an accident in the first place? A friend of Sarah's had brought up this story in 2008 and said that her parents only knew what the camp told them. Supposedly, a phone call came from someone saying that he was Sarah's boyfriend, and she took the camp van without asking. Yet, Sarah apparently didn't have a boyfriend at home and is remembered as having been a super responsible person. The 6th page on Connie's Web Sleuth thread mentions Sarah, though a link to a scholarship in Sarah's memorial doesn't lead to anything in 2022. Phenol Red made an excerpt in a post stating, "These include Sarah Storm's Campership Fund, designed for annual contributions, and the Allison Weingarten Memorial Campership Fund, designed to fund one child at camp every summer for 1 2-week session. Despite my greatest efforts, I just could not get the PDF attached to their post to work in the Internet Archive. There hasn't been any public info available on the scholarship since, so that seems to be as far as that lead goes." Truly, the friend of Sarah Storm's, stated that the caretaker lived in the gatehouse at that time of what I assume to have been Sarah's death. Though, if I understand correctly, this would not have been the same caretaker that was there when Connie went missing. The old director of Camp Sloom. The former camp director, Ernest Pova Roberts, died on December 30th, 1959, at Rockville Center, New York. He was 77 years old, having been born on April 3rd, 1882, in Brooklyn. He has a Find a Grave page and has 2 pages linked his wife and son. There are no photos of them or their graves, except for their sons. Ernest was buried at the Evergreen Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York. His wife, May Blossom Brown, was born on May 1st, 1886. She died on February 15th, 1991, at the age of 104. She is also buried at Evergreen Cemetery, and they married in 1909. Their son, William Grant Roberts, was born on December 19th, 1912, in Poughkeepsie, New York. He died on April 20th, 1993, at the age of 80 in Leesburg, Florida. He's buried with his wife at Lone Oak Cemetery, Leesburg, Florida. It appeared in one census record that Ernest and his wife had another son, but I didn't see a linked page on Find a Grave, so I'm not sure if that person is still alive or not. I would assume potentially if their first son was born in 1912, though. The 1900 census states that Ernest's father was a leather worker. Ernest worked at an office at the age of 17. In the 1910 census, his wife's birthplace was listed as Colorado for some reason. Ernest Roberts had worked at Camp Sloom for 15 years, and so I assume that his time span was about 1938 to 1953 at the camp. On his World War I draft registration card, he listed his occupation as a secretary for the YMCA. He had brown eyes, light red hair, and listed himself as medium height and build. On his World War II draft card, he listed himself as working for the YMCA, though it does not say what. There is a record from August 20th, 1924, of him sailing back to America from Copenhagen. I have no idea what he was doing there. There is another list of citizens arriving from overseas, this time on September 28th, 1926, coming from Bermuda. I'm not sure what these adventures were about, and I assume that it must have had something to do with the YMCA and what is called the World Friendship Tour. In modern day, the Camp Sloom website states that they have counselors from all over the world. In the 1930 census, Roberts was living with his wife, 17-year-old son William, 11-year-old son Donald, and his 83-year-old mother, Emma. It states that his parents were born in England, and his mother's parents came from England, emigrating in 1867. Ernest's occupation was listed as a director of boys' work at Federation, or, as one article said, Federation-y Church. On February 4th, 1938, Roberts was elected director of the South Brooklyn Savings and Loan Association at an annual loan meeting. On April 9th, 1938, it was announced that he was to be the head of Camp Sloom, it being an elected position. Apparently, he was director for 16 years before being at the camp at a place called Camp Massapequa, even having his own camp for 7 years. Roberts directed camps for 23 years before, serving as president of the Camps Directors Association. For 3 years prior, he had conducted his own course in child psychology for the leader of the World Friendship Tour for Boys, visiting 7 countries in Europe, was an author on many articles on camping and boys' and girls' work, along with radio broadcasting. When looking up Camp Massapequa, the only result was a Camp Massapog, located in Dunstable, Massachusetts. This is pretty far from the Camp Sloom area, on the border of New Hampshire and Massachusetts. I'm not sure if this was one of the made-up camps of his, or a YMCA camp that might have been disbanded or merged in modern day. I do want to point out that Ernest P. Roberts was conducting his own course in child psychology without having any sort of college education. Another camp he was in charge of was called Camp Namacus in Norwich, Connecticut. It had boys aged 6 to 15 years. In a 1934 ad, it stated that Roberts was with 20 years of successful camping experience. The camp had modern equipment, excellent food, Indian lore, and more. Small groups were under mature, college-trained counselors. Ironically, in a 1931 article written by himself and posted in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, Roberts stated, "As a parent, I would expect of the camp I select for my boy that properly safeguards and be thrown around my boy, that he would return safely to me. That the camp would maintain high standards of physical vitality and hygienic habits which would carry over into the city life, that the program would be well planned by both boys and staff, considering individual differences, activities wholesome and free from hurry, strain, worry, and envy, that the physical equipment is adequate for safety, health, and comfort, that a scientifically planned diet of well-balanced food is supplied for the growing boy, that the staff personnel is selected with the greatest care, and that character, education, experience, personality, etc., be outstanding requirements. That the camp foster the mental and emotional attitude of seeking, knowing, and understanding the beautiful in the sunset, the picture, and the finished project. In 1941, Ernest Roberts was able to buy the deed to Camp Sloom. Of course, the year before, he killed George Winterrich after the young boy got sick with a strep infection at the camp. A bit later in 1941, on July 19th to be exact, there was an article that was posted in the New York Daily News where Roberts was being sued for the death of George Winterrich. His father, Major John T. Winterrich, on active duty in the military in Washington, because it was wartime, remember, was suing for $80,000, or $1.5 million in 2022. Major Winterrich was asking for $80,000 for damages against the Camp Corporation, the YMCA County Committee, Ernest Roberts, and Dr. S. Fry, the camp doctor. They were being charged with negligence. The doctor failed to note to George's parents that he was ill. Dr. Fry was specifically charged with failure to exercise reasonable care in the diagnosis and treatment of George, his failure to recognize the nature of the illness, his failure to apprise the plaintiffs, George's parents, with the nature and seriousness of the illness, and his violation of the aforesaid statute of the state of Connecticut by practicing without a license in that state. Despite this lawsuit being seen in the media, I was not able to find any sort of conclusion to it, as I know I had stated before. Interestingly, though, in February 1942, in Poughkeepsie Eagle News, there was a judgment of foreclosure where Roberts was named as one of the defendants. In 1943, there was an article posted about a scholarship at the camp that would be given to kids who showed the most physical progress during their season at the camp. Interestingly, Roberts is quoted as saying that each young person who enters the camp is given a complete health and medical examination. Very interesting, as they had been sued 2 years before. After George Hubach Winterrich's death, Roberts seemed to have laid low, not appearing in the news as much as he did before. For almost 40 years straight, if not more, Ernest was in the news from at least 1909 to 1940, talking about how he and the church/YMCA were helping the community and local boys. After the death, most, if not all, of that talk stopped, not appearing in the news like he did in the 30s. On November 28, 1952, the Daily Times posted that Ernest planned to retire on February 1st, 1953, after being at Camp Sloom for 15 years. I do think that is very interesting. How, after 50 years of taking up giant space in the newspaper, his retirement was but a quiet blurb next to a ton of ads. Earlier that year in April, before Connie went missing, a man named Robert D. Burr was coming to Camp Sloom to just become an associate to Ernest. On January 3rd, 1953, Burr was announced as the new camp director. Ernest was retired from active leadership on January 31st, 1953. None of the articles about this announcement mention Connie. After the retirement, Ernest disappeared from all news until his death in 1959. There was never a single picture of him that I could find in the news. Though there was never a conclusion posted about the 1941 lawsuit, I do assume that it must have affected him pretty bad, because for him to pretty much be forced to retire 10 years later when Connie disappeared. All that said, I suppose we should go over Camp Sloom itself. Camp Sloom today. Apparently, Denzel Washington was a counselor at Camp Sloom in 1975, though the post about it on Facebook seems to be privated for some reason. There is a short video of this available on Instagram. Interestingly, the tidbit about Denzel Washington having worked at the camp seems to be true. The Instagram video from 2017 is still available to watch, though for reasons I just honestly don't understand, the post on Facebook is privated, but it still pops up on a Google search, so that tells me it's not deleted. Camp Sloom used to have a Twitter account, but it was deleted at some point with no real reason why. Through the Wayback Machine, it appears that they only had it for about 3 years, from its creation in 2012 through the deletion in 2016. The last archive for it is dated at Valentine's Day 2016. There doesn't seem to be anything interesting or bad on the account, and honestly I assume they just deleted it because back then there was very little point to ever getting on Twitter. There is a review page for the camp on Yelp, though the business is unclaimed, and there have only been about 1 page worth of reviews. Most are positive except one, with a parent saying that their children were lumped in with younger children's activities and they barely spent any time in the water. Honestly, though, I'm always pretty skeptical of Yelp pages in general, as it's really become apparent over the years that reviews can be bought, and trying to do anything against negative fake reviews almost leaves you feeling scammed. The Camp Sloom Facebook page has a 5.0 in reviews, and though Facebook went from stars to recommendation, they still have a good score. Majority of the reviews are from 2019, give or take a year. The one non-recommendation is from the same parent that complained about them on the Yelp page. I'm not sure how genuine the positive reviews are, or if the camp just really is that great in these current years. Granted, it's just also very possible that most people don't feel a need to review pages on Facebook. There are more reviews on Google, where it sits about 4.6. One person gave a 1-star review for their bad experience in the 80s. Another 1 star came from a person whose child had contracted hand-foot-mouth disease. They stated that it was more like a military boot camp than a fun camp. And another person felt that the camp was poorly managed, unsupervised, and disorganized. And another person exploded, just yelling that they hated it. Interestingly, there was a person who gave the camp 1 star, thanks to Connie Smith's disappearance. The owner's response was interesting, and they point out the event happened 66 years ago, which of course is not true, as this happened 70 years ago in 2022, of which this 1-star review came from. For some reason, they replied to this person to tell them to feel free to contact them if they want any info about the camp procedures since 1956. I am unsure why this is the year they listed, as Connie Smith went missing in 1952. But beyond that, though, honestly, there are plenty of reviews of Camp Sloom, with even though people give it 1 star for they hated it in the 80s, well, there's people that give it 5 stars because they loved it in the 60s. The CEO of the camp as of right now is Paul Bear Bryant, having been there since 2006. And from what I found from the Wayback Machine, it seems that he hasn't changed his picture publicly since 2006 either. He's worked with the YMCA for a long time, since the 90s, which that part of his career starting in 1997. He is a well-educated individual who has a bachelor's in political science and Master of Education from the University of Toledo. Nothing honestly seems weird about him, and I have nothing derogatory to say. I'm not sure who his predecessor was or how one could gain such knowledge without contacting the camp directly. There doesn't seem to be any sort of wiki page for the camp individually, though they do have an about page on their website. Camp Sloom started in 1928 in Lakeville, Connecticut. They put a lot of emphasis on the values of their students, stating they hire high quality and well-trained staff. There's tons to do, and they make a point of saying no screens. And I suppose that this is to connect with parents who want their children to become familiar with the great outdoors. Since the beginning, the camp has had canvas-walled platform tents, which would mean this was so in 1952. Looking up photos of such tents gives a much better idea of what it all looked like when events of Connie's case went down. The camp very obviously cares about its image and wants to appear squeaky clean on their website. There are no mentions of Connie, no memorial funds, and an undertone that phones are bad, and the area is tech-free. This even says so on their parents' FAQ, which says, a tech-free environment, and it is expected campers are willing to unplug. No electronics, including phones, tablets, computers, video games, etc. This policy is near and dear to us. We feel strongly that it is important to take time to disconnect, to reconnect, and building real relationships with others isn't going to happen if your face is buried in a screen. Overall, Camp Sloan seems to harbor the antiquated ideology that any sort of electronic is not in anyone's best interest. The idea is very odd to me because in this day and age, anything can happen. I would assume that other parents need to be able to contact their children in case the child needed anything. Despite the camp having protocol for those with medical needs, it honestly seems like they're setting themselves up for failure, for something like what happened to Connie to happen again. I mean, what is the security like? Is there any at all? And why isn't that listed in the FAQ for parents? It doesn't seem fair to me that even to this day, a phone is not allowed. The camp can take pictures of your children doing activities, yet the campers cannot share memories themselves? What happens if a child has a medical episode? Do they wait to tell the parents? Or are they contacted immediately? Counselors can have phones, which feels kind of off to me. An adult can be around children, and the counselors seem to sleep in the same tent as the children, and yet the children cannot do anything, even call their mother before going to sleep at night. There doesn't seem to be anything about bullying on the website, which I actually do find concerning. I would have imagined that such a place would have at least placed a public policy with no tolerance on bullying, especially since they don't refer to their campers as campers, but rather students, of which they pay tuition to join. So if this is essentially a school teaching children, shouldn't there be a public no bullying policy, as many schools do? Truthfully, I will admit, though, that Camp Sloom seems to be a much better place now than it was back then. I mean, once Robert Burr took over as camp director, things pretty much turned to normal for the most part. The camp wasn't mentioned in the news like it was before, and for the next 35 years ago or so, the camp would be mentioned sparingly, only for a yearly listing of showing fireworks for the 4th of July and the occasional anniversary pieces of Connie's disappearance. Ernest P. Roberts' successor, Robert Burr, retired from Camp Sloom in 1969 and passed away in 1986 at the age of 77, which in some ways I found to be kind of wild because Ernest P. Roberts also died at the age of 77. Burr is buried in East Cemetery in Manchester, Connecticut. In the years since Connie's disappearance, there have been articles that renew interest in the case, though it seems no leads from the past 6 decades have brought up much of anything. Almost every decade since has posted an article about the case except for the 90s. In 1988, the renewed interest in the case is once again where it seems the lead of William Redmond, having been Connie's potential killer, came from. In Salisbury, the residents sifted through the police records in order to gain any new clues. Truthfully, I personally don't believe we will ever know what truly happened to Connie that day. The more articles I looked up about Ernest P. Roberts, the more convinced I am that he had something to do with her disappearance, especially since it took him 3 hours to call the police. I am highly suspicious of Roberts and what other heinous things he did the years before Connie disappeared, especially once I found out about George Winterrich's death, and then how he bought the deed to the camp the year after George's death. 2 children, at least, are gone when they were supposed to be under his supervision. Even that number is too many. I wonder how many more children were there that were traumatized and that we don't know of. The scary thing is that all of the information I read in Web Sleuths was real. I was able to find evidence to support all of it. The one lead I wasn't able to look into directly was that the camp hired and had known pedophiles in the camp. I don't doubt this, though, and honestly, I have my own suspicions that Ernest P. Roberts might have been one himself. Even still, there were news articles stating that police did question sex offenders. The way Roberts projected himself for decades to be an upstanding citizen, making a front for himself by seeming like a man of God, and one that just cared so much about the children, honestly is really suspicious to me. A lot of his facades in the case remind me of Mac Ray Edwards, who made himself appear like an upstanding guy, when in reality, he was hurting children. Edwards had things like horses that he would let local children ride on. There was suspicion that he may have had ties with the Boy Scouts, which may have allowed him access to certain children. There's also the case of Scott Andreas Sims, who went missing and still has yet to be found. There has been suspicion that he may have been the victim of an inappropriate relation between him and a leader, potentially having been kidnapped by one of those who overlooked his troop. There has been proof of perversion in the Boy Scouts, with the perversion files dating back to 1919 in some sources. I personally did not see why this just couldn't be true for a situation like this. In fact, there is even an interactive map created by the LA Times where you can see listings of these cases by year and state. Granted, this is all speculation, and it is ultimately up for you to decide. The proof that Ernest P. Roberts was a slimy guy is irrefutable. We know of one child who did die because of him, and at first he almost went free. I think Roberts had something to do with Connie's disappearance, or at least indirectly. The 3 hours it took for him to call the police makes me wonder, did he use it to hide her body instead of actually look for her? Was that time used to create an alibi? Or perhaps, was it to cover up for somebody else? I think that Connie was taken somewhere that was rather in plain sight. Not necessarily somewhere you could see, but a place you just wouldn't have expected. Others, like me, wonder if Connie ever even left the camp. Granted, if she did, who's to say that one of the staff didn't pick her up? If the police dogs really picked up on her scent on Route 44, can we speculate that she got into someone's car? Ultimately, I believe the truth died with Ernest P. Roberts. I've had other thoughts and theories about what might have happened to Connie, and in my mind, I feel like there still is a possibility that she could have possibly been in a body of water somewhere. There was a case in the Midwest from the 70s of 2 girls who were thought to have been potentially murdered, but it was found out in the last decade or so that they had simply gone missing because accidentally drove off the road into a river and drowned, the water covering the car completely. It wasn't until decades later, when the water level was very low, that people found this car, and it was discovered that these women unfortunately had an accident and where they died. I looked at the maps in the area, and there are plenty of bodies of water, and this is just one of my reasons why I feel like, well, even though police did search all the water and all the places around Camp Sloom, I feel like maybe the lake at the camp itself could have been where Connie stayed. I do wonder, why was Connie at the camp to begin with? Camp Sloom is 2 to 3 hours away from Greenwich, Connecticut, and I never did find any resource saying if Connie wanted to go in the first place. I wonder if her mother made the decision to send her there and Connie just had to live with it. The camp may have been chosen because of its reputation before being a place of fun. Granted, the camp was searched by law enforcement, but police now still review the case from time to time. I also wonder what happened to Connie's belongings that were left behind at the camp. There wasn't anything in my research that told me anything about that. I wonder if these or any of her things are still with the family to this day. Granted, I know that at this point it's 70 years ago, so if they did keep anything she left behind, it probably wouldn't have any viable DNA. I don't believe, honestly, that Connie left voluntarily if her glasses were broken, unless, as some people have stated, it was like a dire circumstance. There were some sources saying that she didn't have her glasses, and some of the more recent blog posts stated the glasses were broken, but come to think of it, I don't know how her glasses broke. Did they break when she fell? Did they break for other reasons? I've wondered, as others have, if someone told her to meet them in Lakeville someplace, and that might have been why she decided to go there. I wonder if it was possible if maybe there was something messed up, like an inappropriate relationship with her. But granted, that doesn't seem very likely if she was leaving the camp and crying at the same time. Law enforcement did look at August Epp for a while, and they believed he might have been pretty suspicious because he kind of just up and left at one point to go to California. Granted, when they looked it up, they couldn't connect him to the crime at all. It seemed, though, that he did have one family member that lived in California, but August Epp doesn't seem as suspicious to me as, once again, Ernest P. Roberts was. And honestly, beyond that, there's really not much else known about the case. I'm honestly very surprised that with how old the case is and how, I guess, popular it was at the height of its day, that at this point now it's just kind of fizzled out. Peter Smith lived a very long time, and he was almost 100 years old. It's kind of sad that in the new millennium, the search for his daughter has pretty much died out. Granted, after 60 plus years, I guess you can't really expect to create something new to arouse attention. I was surprised when I looked up this case that there was virtually nothing online about it. Of course, there's NamUs and the Charlie Project, but I really hoped that there would have been other videos from other people about it. And I tried to find the video of Connie's father on the Art Linkletter show, but that didn't seem to show up on YouTube. Personally, I don't believe that Connie ever left the state of Connecticut. And I just hope that one day that we can find an answer, one way or another. In our modern day and age, old cold cases are being solved all the time in reality, thanks to technology and science. So I hope that maybe with the right science and the right technology, we can solve Connie's case too.